Hello, dear history travelers, and welcome back to another journey into the hidden corners of the past. I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend your time here with me today, exploring the stories that history books gloss over and the human truths that make our ancestors feel real. Before we descend into the fascinating and exhausting world of medieval sleep, or the lack thereof, I have a small request. If you find value in these deep explorations of history's most intriguing mysteries, please take just a moment to subscribe to this channel and click that notification bell. It's your support that allows us to continue uncovering these forgotten stories and bringing them to life. Also, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me which aspect of medieval life you'd like us to explore next. Every comment is read, every suggestion considered. Now, settle in somewhere comfortable, perhaps even in your own bed, and prepare to appreciate your ability to sleep peacefully in a way you never have before. Let's enter the restless, paranoid, exhausting world of medieval monarchy, where the crown truly never rested. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You are a medieval king. You've just survived another day of grueling governance, settling disputes that could spark civil war, managing nobles who smile while plotting your death, making military decisions that will determine the fate of thousands. You're exhausted. Every bone aches. Your mind is foggy from stress and the weight of impossible decisions. Finally, night falls. Time to rest, right? Wrong. Because the moment you close your eyes, you are at your most vulnerable. Your bedchamber, despite its guards and locked doors, is the easiest place to kill you. Poison in your wine, a blade in the darkness, a pillow pressed over your face while you sleep. History is littered with kings who went to bed and never woke up. So you don't sleep. Not really. Not deeply. Not safely. Instead, you develop elaborate rituals. You surround yourself with guards who watch you sleep. Yes, literally watch you all night long. You employ food tasters and sleep testers. You move between bedrooms unpredictably. You train yourself to wake at the slightest sound. You sleep in shifts, in snatches, never allowing yourself the vulnerable unconsciousness that your body desperately craves. And this isn't just paranoia. This is survival. Because dozens of your fellow monarchs throughout history were murdered in their sleep, their dynasties ending because they let their guard down for just a few hours. This is the reality that history doesn't tell you. Medieval kings were among the most sleep-deprived people in their kingdoms. The crown was indeed heavy, but its weight was felt most acutely at night, when it prevented them from experiencing the rest that even their lowest peasant could enjoy. Today, we're going to explore the nocturnal world of medieval monarchy. We'll discover the shocking sleep schedules of history's most powerful rulers, the bizarre rituals they developed to protect themselves at night, the servants whose entire job was to manage royal sleep, and the catastrophic decisions made by exhausted kings whose judgment was impaired by chronic sleep deprivation. We'll meet Louis XIV, who turned his bedtime into a public spectacle involving hundreds of people. We'll witness the paranoid nights of Richard III, who never slept in the same place twice. We'll explore the assassination attempts that made every royal bedroom a potential crime scene. And we'll discover how the simple human need for sleep shaped wars, successions, and the fate of nations. So, prepare yourself for a journey into history's most exclusive insomnia club, where the price of power was measured not in gold, but in sleepless nights. To understand how medieval kings slept, or didn't, we must first understand the spaces in which they attempted to rest. The royal bedchamber was nothing like the private, intimate bedroom we imagine today. It was simultaneously the most private and most public space in the entire palace, a paradox that defined royal life and made genuine rest nearly impossible. Let's begin with the physical layout.
A typical medieval royal bedchamber was enormous by our standards, often 30 to 40 feet across, with ceilings soaring 10 or 20 feet high. The bed itself was a massive affair, not just a piece of furniture, but an architectural statement. These beds could be 10 feet long and 8 feet wide, raised on platforms, surrounded by heavy curtains that could be drawn for privacy and warmth. But here's what's crucial to understand. This bed was rarely used just for sleeping. It was a throne of sorts, a seat of power, where the king conducted business, received important visitors, and displayed his power. Nobles considered it an honor to be received in the royal bedchamber. Treaties were negotiated there. Secrets were shared there. The bed was a seat of power, which meant it could never truly be a place of rest. The curtains around the bed served multiple purposes. Yes, they provided privacy and warmth in drafty medieval chambers, but they also created a kind of inner sanctum, a final barrier between the king and the world. When those curtains were drawn, the king was theoretically alone, safe, invisible. But even this privacy was compromised because the bedchamber was never truly empty. Ever.
Let me paint you a picture of a typical royal bedchamber at night. The king lies in his great bed, curtains drawn. But outside those curtains, the room is full of people. Near the bed, on pallets on the floor or in small alcoves, sleep several trusted servants, the grooms of the bedchamber, whose literal job is to sleep within arm's reach of the king. They're there ostensibly to attend to any need that might arise during the night, but their real purpose is security. They're human alarm systems, witnesses who can testify that no assassin approached the royal bed. Beyond them, guards stand at the chamber door. Depending on the era and the king's level of paranoia, there might be one guard or a dozen. During particularly tense periods, guards would be stationed at multiple points, at the chamber door, at the entrance to the royal apartments, at strategic points along the corridors leading to the king's rooms. And it wasn't just about the people present. The bedchamber itself was designed with security in mind. Many royal bedchambers had only one door, easily guarded. Others had secret passages, which sounds romantic but was actually terrifying, because a secret passage you knew about could also be known to your enemies. Some kings had these passages sealed. Others used them strategically, moving through their own palaces like ghosts to avoid predictable patterns. The windows presented another challenge. Large enough to provide light and air, they were also potential entry points for assassins. You might think upper-floor bedchambers were safe, but medieval assassins were remarkably resourceful. Windows would be barred, shuttered, and sometimes guarded from outside by men stationed on adjacent roofs or balconies. Now, let's consider the bed itself in more detail, because it's a fascinating artifact of both power and paranoia. The mattresses were stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool, piled several feet thick. The king didn't sleep on one mattress, but on a stack of them, creating a kind of soft fortress. Heavy blankets and furs provided warmth, but their weight also created a sense of being buried, trapped. The pillows were scrutinized carefully. This wasn't just about comfort. A poisoned pillow, or one containing harmful substances that released fumes when warmed by body heat, could kill without leaving obvious evidence. Pillow inspection became a nightly ritual, often performed by trusted servants who knew exactly how each pillow should look, feel, and even smell. The bed hangings themselves were works of art, heavy tapestries or embroidered fabrics depicting religious scenes, family coats of arms, or symbolic imagery. But they also had a practical purpose. They dampened sound. This was both good and bad for a sleeping king. Good because it muffled the noise from the rest of the chamber, allowing some possibility of sleep. Bad because it also muffled sounds that might warn of approaching danger. Some beds had additional features that seem almost absurd to us now, but were deadly serious then. Hidden compartments where the king could stash weapons, a dagger always within reach, even in sleep. Special construction that made the bed creak in particular ways when approached, serving as an acoustic alarm system. Certain kings even insisted on beds designed so they could see the chamber door without lifting their heads, maintaining visual surveillance even while lying down.
The lighting in the bedchamber tells its own story. Complete darkness was dangerous. You couldn't see an attacker coming, but too much light made sleep impossible and cast shadows that could conceal threats. The solution was carefully managed candlelight or oil lamps, positioned to illuminate the approaches to the bed without shining in the king's eyes. Servants were tasked with maintaining these lights throughout the night, replacing candles as they burned down, trimming wicks, ensuring the king was never in complete darkness. Temperature control was another critical factor. Medieval chambers were notoriously cold, especially in winter. Fireplaces blazed, but they created new problems. The servants who maintained the fire had to be absolutely trusted. They had access to the chamber all night and could easily be bribed or coerced. Some paranoid kings insisted on fireplaces that could be stoked from outside the chamber, requiring elaborate architectural solutions. The floors were often covered with rushes or early carpets, which had to be changed regularly because they could hide weapons, poisons, or even people. Yes, people. There are documented cases of assassination attempts where assailants hid beneath furniture or floor coverings for hours, waiting for the household to settle before they made their move. And we haven't even discussed the sanitary arrangements. Medieval royalty used chamber pots and close stools, early toilets, which had to be emptied during the night, which meant servants entering and exiting the bedchamber even during sleeping hours, creating additional security concerns. Some kings insisted on watching these servants remove the waste, paranoid that the act of emptying the chamber pot could provide cover for other more sinister activities. All of this, the crowds of servants, the guards, the security measures, the lights, the maintained fires, the coming and going, created an environment that was about as conducive to restful sleep as a busy train station. And this was supposedly the most private, most secure space in the entire kingdom.
Is it any wonder that medieval kings struggled to sleep? They were trying to rest in what was essentially a fortified public space, surrounded by people, acutely aware that this moment of vulnerability was when their enemies were most likely to strike. The architecture of royal sleep was designed to keep them alive, but in doing so, it made genuine rest almost impossible. This was the paradox at the heart of royal life. The more power you had, the less privacy you enjoyed. The higher you rose, the less freedom you possessed. And nowhere was this more evident than in the bedchamber, where the need for security transformed what should have been a sanctuary into a theater of perpetual vigilance. If the architecture of royal sleep was complex, the human system supporting it was even more elaborate. Medieval kings didn't just have servants, they had entire hierarchies of specialists devoted to the single task of managing their sleep. These weren't just people who happened to work at night. They held specific positions with specific duties, all designed to ensure the king could rest as safely and comfortably as possible in an environment that made both safety and comfort nearly impossible. Let's start with the most intimate of these positions, the grooms of the bedchamber. In many courts, particularly in England and France, this was one of the most prestigious positions a nobleman could hold. These weren't mere servants in the modern sense. They were often younger sons of noble families, men of good breeding who had earned the king's trust. The groom's duties began hours before the king retired. They supervised the preparation of the bedchamber, checking that everything was in order. But their most important work began when the king actually went to sleep. A typical rotation might include 3 or 4 grooms per night, taking shifts so that someone was always alert, always watching. What exactly were they watching for? Everything. They monitored who entered and left the chamber. They listened for unusual sounds, footsteps where there shouldn't be any, whispers, the scrape of a window opening. They watched the king himself, alert for signs of distress that might indicate poison or illness. If the king coughed, choked, or cried out in his sleep, a groom would investigate immediately. These men slept, if they slept at all, on pallets near the royal bed, close enough to hear the king's breathing. This proximity was both an honor and a burden. On one hand, it demonstrated ultimate trust. The king was literally trusting them with his life.
On the other, it meant their own sleep was constantly interrupted, and they bore an enormous responsibility. If something happened to the king on their watch, they could be executed for negligence, even if they themselves were innocent of any plot. Beyond the grooms, there were other specialized sleep servants. The yeomen of the bedchamber handled more practical matters, maintaining the fires, trimming candles, ensuring chamber pots were available and emptied discreetly. They were the infrastructure workers of the royal sleep operation. Then there were the food tasters, who had an especially active role at bedtime. Kings often consumed wine, warm milk with spices, or herbal preparations before bed to help them sleep. Every single item had to be tasted, not just once, but often twice or even 3 times by different people. The logic was simple. If an assassin had bribed one taster, perhaps the others remained loyal. But here's the dark reality of this system. Being a food taster was literally risking your life every single day. If the drink was poisoned, you died so the king could live. Some poisons acted slowly, which is why tasters would consume the wine or food some time before the king. If they were still alive and healthy after 30 minutes, the king could safely drink. Imagine having that job, knowing that every sip you took might be your last. There were also specialized servants called strewers of the rushes, whose job was to replace the floor coverings daily, ensuring nothing could be hidden in them overnight. In more paranoid courts, these servants worked under armed supervision, watched to ensure they weren't planting anything dangerous while pretending to clean. The keeper of the Privy Seal had an interesting nighttime duty, securing the king's seal, which could be used to issue royal commands. During the day, the seal was constantly in use, but at night it had to be locked away. Because if an assassin could access both the king and his seal, they could issue orders in his name, potentially causing chaos even if the assassination attempt failed.
Some courts employed what were essentially professional bedmakers, people whose sole expertise was in preparing the royal bed to exact specifications. They knew precisely how many mattresses, which blankets, the optimal arrangement of pillows. This consistency was important because any deviation from the normal arrangement might indicate tampering. There were also specialist physicians whose role intensified at night. Medieval medicine believed that sleep was a vulnerable time when the body's humors could become imbalanced, making the sleeper susceptible to illness. These physicians might prepare special sleep drafts, monitor the king's health during the night, or be on call in case the king woke feeling unwell. The most unusual position, found in some courts, was essentially a human alarm clock, a servant tasked with waking the king at a specific time or under certain conditions. This seems simple, but it was fraught with danger. Wake the king too early, and you risked royal anger. Wake him too late, and you might miss something critical, a military emergency, a diplomatic crisis, or a scheduled dawn meeting. And how exactly do you wake a paranoid medieval king without startling him into thinking you're an assassin? These servants developed careful techniques, soft coughs from a distance, gentle announcement of their presence, never sudden movements or touches. Guards, of course, were everywhere, but not all guards were equal. The household guard who protected the royal apartments were elite soldiers, chosen as much for loyalty as for martial skill. They underwent background checks that were remarkably thorough for the era. Their families were investigated, their associations scrutinized, their loyalty tested. Some kings had special units that served only at night guards who worked in rotating shifts, ensuring that no individual became too familiar with the patterns and schedules that could be exploited by conspirators. These guards were often kept separate from day guards, with different commanders, different loyalties, creating a system of checks and balances. What's fascinating is the economic and social cost of all this. A large medieval court might have 50 to 100 people whose primary or sole responsibility was managing the king's sleep.
That's an enormous expenditure of human resources for what we now think of as a simple biological necessity. But it reflects how valuable the king was to the system. His life represented political stability, succession, the continuation of government. Protecting his sleep was protecting the nation. The servants themselves formed a complex social hierarchy. To be a groom of the bedchamber was to be in the inner circle, privy to the king's most vulnerable moments, trusted with his life. These positions were sought after, competed for, sometimes even purchased or inherited. There are records of fathers in their wills leaving these positions to sons as if they were property. But it wasn't all prestige and power. These servants paid a price for their proximity to the king. They lived on his schedule, not their own. If the king was an insomniac, and many were, then everyone around him suffered from sleep deprivation too. If the king decided to wake at 3 a.m. and conduct business, the entire sleep household had to be alert and functional. There's also the psychological burden. These servants knew things about the king's health, his fears, his weaknesses. They saw him at his most vulnerable. This knowledge was both valuable and dangerous. A servant who knew too much could be targeted by the king's enemies, bribed or threatened to reveal secrets or participate in plots. Some kings rotated their sleep servants frequently to prevent anyone from learning too much. And what about the servants' own safety? If an assassination attempt occurred, they were the first line of defense, expected to literally throw their bodies between the assassin and the king. Many did exactly that, dying in service to their monarch. Their sacrifice was sometimes remembered and honored, sometimes forgotten in the larger narrative of royal survival. The training these servants received was extensive. They learned to move silently, to observe without being noticed, to detect subtle signs of tampering or danger. They were taught to taste food and recognize the signs of various poisons, bitter tastes, unusual smells, strange consistencies. They learned to read the king's moods and needs, to anticipate problems before they arose. In effect, the royal sleep staff was a specialized security force mixed with hospitality professionals, all operating in an environment of extreme stress and high stakes. They created a bubble of controlled safety around the king's most vulnerable hours, a human shield of vigilance and service that allowed him to sleep at all, however poorly. And yet, despite all these precautions, despite all these people, kings were still murdered in their beds. The system was never perfect, which tells us something important. No amount of servants, guards, or protocols could completely eliminate the risk. The crown never rested because it could never truly be safe. And the servants, for all their dedication, could only minimize the danger, never eliminate it entirely.
Now let's turn to the nightmares that kept medieval kings awake. Not the dreams that troubled their sleep, but the very real threats that made sleep itself dangerous. The bedchamber was supposed to be a sanctuary, but history shows us it was often a crime scene, or very nearly so. Let's explore some of the most dramatic assassination attempts that occurred at night and see how they shaped royal sleeping habits for generations. We'll start with one of the most famous, the murder of Edward II of England in 1327. Now, there's historical debate about exactly how Edward died, but the traditional account is so horrifying it's worth examining for what it tells us about medieval assassination methods and the vulnerability of sleeping royalty. Edward had been deposed and imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. On the night of September 21st, according to chroniclers, assassins entered his chamber while he slept. The method they allegedly used was specifically designed to leave no external marks. They inserted a red-hot poker into his body in a manner too gruesome to describe in detail.
Whether or not this actually happened, the story was believed and repeated for centuries, serving as a terrifying reminder that even a deposed king in a locked cell wasn't safe. The psychological impact on future kings was profound. If a king in captivity could be murdered in such a way, what chance did a ruling king have? This wasn't a clean assassination from a distance. This required multiple people to be physically present in the chamber, to restrain the victim, to carry out the act. It meant that all the guards, all the locked doors had either failed or been compromised. The message was clear. Nowhere was safe. Let's move forward to another chilling example, the murder of James I of Scotland in 1437. James was staying at Blackfriars Monastery in Perth when assassins struck. What makes this case particularly instructive is that we know the details because some of the king's household survived and testified. The assassins, led by Sir Robert Graham, had been plotting for weeks. They knew the layout of the monastery, knew where the king slept, knew his routines. On the night of February 20th, they removed planks from a nearby bridge so the king couldn't escape, then broke into his chambers around bedtime. James was in his nightclothes, completely vulnerable. He tried to escape through a sewer tunnel. There was actually a drainage opening in his chamber floor, but it had recently been blocked. The king, trapped, was stabbed to death. His queen, Joan Beaufort, was wounded trying to defend him. What's significant here is that this wasn't a spontaneous attack. The assassins had studied the king's sleeping arrangements, identified vulnerabilities, and exploited them. They knew that nighttime was when his guard would be smallest, when he'd be most vulnerable, when confusion would be on their side. And they knew that even a monastery, theoretically a sacred, safe place, could be penetrated. Another instructive case, the near assassination of King Henry VI of France, later Henry III, in 1589, though he eventually was assassinated later. An earlier attempt involved a would-be assassin gaining access to the royal chambers by disguising himself as a servant. He was caught before he could strike, but the ease with which he penetrated supposedly secure areas terrified the court. After this incident, Henry instituted new protocols. All servants working near his bedchamber had to be personally known to the king, not just to his officials. Guards were ordered to check faces, not just credentials. Perhaps the most paranoid response to bedroom assassination threats came from Richard III of England. Historical records and contemporary accounts suggest Richard rarely slept in the same place twice in a row. He had multiple bedchambers prepared throughout his residences, and his staff wouldn't know which one he'd actually use until he chose it himself, sometimes at the last moment. This strategy had logic behind it. If even his own household didn't know where he'd sleep, assassins couldn't plan. They couldn't bribe the right servants, couldn't position themselves in the right location, couldn't study the specific security measures of a particular chamber. But it also meant Richard was constantly displacing himself, never able to settle, never able to fully relax in familiar surroundings.
The psychological toll must have been immense. Imagine never sleeping in the same bed twice, never developing the comfort of routine, always alert for threats even as you tried to rest. Some historians argue that Richard's erratic behavior during his short reign, documented mood swings, impulsive decisions, apparent exhaustion, may have been partly due to severe sleep deprivation caused by this paranoid sleeping arrangement. There's also the attempted poisoning of King John of England, though details are murky. According to some accounts, poison was introduced into his bedtime wine in 1216. Whether he actually drank it or a taster caught it first is unclear, but John became obsessed with wine security afterward, insisting on absurdly elaborate tasting protocols. Some sources claim he sometimes made servants drink from his cup hours before he would, watching them for signs of delayed action poison. Let's consider the assassination of King Albert I of Germany in 1308. While not technically in his bedchamber, the attack occurred at a rest stop during travel, another vulnerable moment when the king was trying to sleep.
His nephew, John, along with accomplices, stabbed him to death. This reinforced the understanding that any sleeping situation, not just the permanent royal bedchamber, was dangerous. The murder of Pedro the Cruel of Castile in 1369 is another example. Pedro was killed by his half-brother Henry while supposedly under a flag of truce. The attack came at night, in quarters where Pedro had been assured of safety. The lesson? Even explicit promises of safety meant nothing when powerful people wanted you dead. These weren't isolated incidents. Throughout the medieval period, dozens of kings, princes, and nobles were murdered in their beds or sleeping quarters. And for every successful assassination, there were probably dozens of failed attempts that scared survivors into changing their habits. The paranoia this created was justified but debilitating. Some kings developed elaborate routines designed to make them unpredictable. Charles VI of France, who had mental illness but moments of lucidity, sometimes had servants set up multiple beds in different rooms, complete with warming pans and turned-down covers, so assassins wouldn't know which contained the actual king. Others used body doubles. There are accounts of kings having trusted servants sleep in the royal bed while the king slept elsewhere in the chamber, or even in a different room entirely. The servant was essentially a human sacrifice, accepting the risk of being murdered in mistake for the king. The introduction of gunpowder weapons in the later medieval period created new anxieties. Early firearms were loud and inaccurate, but they could potentially kill from a distance. Kings began worrying about shots fired through windows, leading to even more elaborate window coverings and guards posted at strange angles to prevent lines of sight into the royal bedchamber. Poison remained the most feared method because it was so difficult to detect. Medieval toxicology was primitive. Symptoms of poisoning often mimicked natural illness, and poisons could be introduced not just in food and drink, but in fabrics, in candle smoke, in bath water, even in the ink on documents the king might touch before bed.
This led to increasingly baroque precautions. Some kings insisted that all fabrics in the bedchamber be washed daily in supervised conditions. Others required that candles be made under guard from trusted sources of wax and wick. Documents to be read at night had to be examined by specialists who claimed they could detect poisoned ink. Whether they actually could is doubtful. The psychological impact of living under this constant threat cannot be overstated. Modern sleep science tells us that feeling unsafe is one of the primary impediments to restful sleep. The human brain simply cannot fully relax if it perceives danger. And medieval kings had excellent reasons to perceive danger. Their fellow monarchs were being murdered regularly, often by people they trusted, often in supposedly secure bedchambers. This created a vicious cycle. Poor sleep led to impaired judgment, which led to political mistakes, which created more enemies, which increased the threat level, which made sleep even more difficult. Some kings became genuinely mentally unstable under the strain, their paranoia spiraling beyond reason. Charles VI of France, mentioned earlier, developed a delusion that he was made of glass and would shatter if touched, a condition possibly exacerbated by chronic sleep deprivation and the constant stress of fearing assassination. His madness made France's governance chaotic, which created more instability, which made everyone around him more fearful. The murder of kings had cascading effects beyond the immediate victim. It created precedents, demonstrated methods, inspired imitators. Each successful assassination was a case study in security failure that other monarchs studied obsessively, implementing new measures to prevent similar fates. But here's the dark truth. No system was proof-full. Determined assassins, especially those from within the household, could usually find a way. The very servants meant to protect the king could be turned through bribes, threats, or ideological conviction. Guards could be posted at doors, but who guarded the guards? Who ensured their loyalty? This fundamental insecurity meant that medieval kings could never truly rest.
Sleep required trust, trust in the people around you, trust in the security measures, trust that you'd wake up in the morning. But the historical record kept giving them reasons not to trust. The crown never rested because rest required safety, and safety was an illusion that could be shattered by a dagger in the dark. Given all the security concerns and architectural complexities we've discussed, you might wonder, how did medieval kings actually go to bed? The answer is that bedtime wasn't a simple matter of putting on nightclothes and lying down. It was an elaborate ritual, sometimes taking hours, involving dozens of people and hundreds of small procedural steps. Let's explore the fascinating ceremonies that surrounded the simple act of a king going to sleep. We'll focus particularly on the French court, which developed the most elaborate bedtime ritual in European history, the coucher du roi, or the king's bedtime. While this ceremony reached its Baroque peak under Louis XIV in the later 17th century, its roots lay in medieval practices, and examining it reveals principles that applied throughout the period. The process began in the early evening, immediately after the king's supper. The gentlemen of the bedchamber would begin preparations, ensuring the bedchamber was properly arranged. This wasn't just making the bed, it was a complete security sweep. Every piece of furniture was checked. Curtains were examined for tears or alterations that might conceal tampering. The bed itself was carefully inspected, mattresses compressed to ensure nothing was hidden inside them. Meanwhile, the king would be in his state apartments, conducting evening business, receiving reports, making decisions, holding audiences. But at a certain hour, determined by tradition in the season, he would announce his intention to retire. This announcement set the entire bedtime ritual in motion. The king would proceed to his bedchamber, but not alone. He would be accompanied by a carefully ranked procession of nobles, each with specific roles in the ceremony to come. To attend the king's bedtime was a privilege, and the closer you could get to the actual bed, the higher your status.
Upon entering the bedchamber, the king was ceremonially undressed. This wasn't a private moment of removing clothes. It was a public ritual with strict protocols. The highest-ranking noble present had the honor of removing the king's outer garments. Lower-ranked nobles removed lesser items. Each piece of clothing was handed off in a specific order to specific servants. Why make such a public ceremony of something so intimate? Several reasons. First, it prevented any single servant from having prolonged private contact with the vulnerable, partially clothed king, safety through witnesses. Second, it reinforced social hierarchy, reminding everyone of their place. Third, it turned a dangerous moment of transition from formal king to vulnerable sleeper into a controlled, predictable ceremony where any deviation would be immediately noticed. The king would be dressed in his nightclothes, not pajamas as we know them, but elaborate linen shirts and sometimes caps, all made from fabrics that had been carefully inspected and stored under guard. Even the king's nightclothes were potential weapons. Poisoned fabric was a real fear, so only garments that had been secured from creation to the moment of use were acceptable. Next came the ritual of the nightcap. In many courts, the king would be presented with a selection of beverages, warm wine with spices, herbal infusions, sometimes warm milk. Each would be elaborately tasted, not just once, but multiple times, with significant waiting periods between tastings to allow time for slow-acting poisons to manifest. The king would choose his drink, often varying his choice unpredictably to prevent anyone from knowing in advance which cup to poison. While drinking, the king might conduct some final business. Intimate advisors might whisper last-minute intelligence. The king might sign documents or issue final orders for the next day. This mixing of public business with private bedtime ritual was distinctly medieval. The separation between public life and private life that we take for granted simply didn't exist for royalty. Then came the blessing,
A chaplain or high-ranking religious figure would offer prayers for the king's safety through the night, asking God's protection from dangers seen and unseen. This wasn't mere formality, it was genuine supplication born of genuine fear. The prayers often specifically mentioned protection from poison, from steel, from evil intentions. After the blessing, the moment came for the king to actually get into bed. This was choreographed with military precision. The king would approach the bed from a specific side. Servants would pull back the heavy curtains at exactly the right moment. The king would climb onto the high bed, sometimes requiring a step stool, which itself had to be inspected for stability and tampering. He would settle into the arranged pillows and covers. And then, the room didn't empty. This is crucial to understand. Even after the king was in bed, ready to sleep, the bedchamber remained populated. The grooms of the bedchamber would take their positions. Guards would stand at doors and strategic points. Servants who tended the fires and lights would stay at their posts. The bed curtains would be drawn, creating the illusion of privacy, but everyone knew it was just that, an illusion. The king was never truly alone, never truly unwatched. Even in the dark, behind the curtains, he knew people were listening to him breathe, ready to investigate any sound of distress. Some kings developed personal bedtime routines within this larger ceremonial framework. Charles V of France was known to have documents read to him as he fell asleep, essentially medieval audiobooks. His servants would read in gentle voices until his breathing indicated he'd fallen asleep, then carefully withdraw. Henry VIII of England in his later years required extensive physical assistance getting into bed due to his obesity and leg ulcers. The ritual of helping him into bed was both medically necessary and deeply humiliating for a man who prided himself on his former athletic prowess. Servants had to be both strong enough to lift him and delicate enough to do so without causing pain or offense. Some rituals were deeply personal and quirky. One French king insisted on having the curtains opened briefly at intervals throughout the night so he could confirm the guards were still alert. Another required that a small bell be placed within reach so he could summon help without having to shout. Shouting would show weakness and disturb others.
The morning ritual, the Lever du Roi, was equally elaborate, essentially the bedtime ceremony in reverse. But between the evening ritual and the morning one lay the long, uncertain hours of the night, when ritual gave way to the reality of attempted sleep in an environment designed to prevent it. What's striking about these rituals is how they tried to impose order and safety through procedure. If every step was done correctly, in the right order, by the right people, then theoretically the king would be safe. The ritual became a kind of magic spell, a protective charm woven from protocol and precedent. But of course, it didn't always work. Assassins could learn the ritual as well as anyone. They could position themselves to exploit the moments of transition, the gaps between procedural steps. Some of the most successful assassination attempts occurred precisely during these elaborate ceremonies, when everyone was focused on following the protocol rather than actually watching for threats. Still, the rituals persisted and grew more elaborate over time because they served important psychological functions. They created the feeling of control in a fundamentally uncontrollable situation. They turned the terrifying vulnerability of sleep into a managed, proceduralized event. They allowed kings to feel like they were doing something to protect themselves, even if that something was ultimately as much theater as security. And for the nobles who participated, these rituals were valuable in themselves. To be invited to attend the king's bedtime was to be in the inner circle. The closer you stood to the royal bed, the more influence you had. Ambitious courtiers competed for these positions not because they enjoyed watching the king undress, but because proximity to power was power. The bedtime ritual, then, was simultaneously a security protocol,
a religious ceremony, a social hierarchy on display, and a psychological crutch. It was the medieval monarchy's answer to the impossible challenge of how to safely sleep when your crown made you a target. It didn't solve the problem, but it helped manage it, turning the chaos of vulnerability into the comfort of routine, however elaborate and exhausting that routine might be. Now that we understand the environment and rituals of royal sleep, let's examine what actually happened to these kings' bodies and minds as they struggled with chronic sleep deprivation. Medieval people didn't understand sleep science as we do, but they definitely noticed the effects of not getting enough of it. And modern sleep research can help us understand what these kings were experiencing. The human body requires sleep for fundamental biological functions. During sleep, the brain consolidates memories, processes emotions, and clears out metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours. The body repairs tissue, synthesizes proteins, releases growth hormones. Sleep isn't optional. It's as necessary as food or water, even if you can survive longer without it. Medieval kings were operating in a state of chronic partial sleep deprivation. They might get some sleep, but rarely enough, and almost never quality sleep. Let's understand what this did to them. First, cognitive impairment. Modern sleep studies show that after just one night of poor sleep, cognitive function declines significantly. Reaction times slow, decision-making becomes impaired, the ability to assess risk diminishes, complex reasoning suffers. Now imagine not one night, but years, decades of inadequate sleep.
Medieval kings were making decisions that affected millions of people while operating with brains that weren't functioning properly. They were deciding whether to go to war, whom to trust, how to respond to crises, all while sleep-deprived. Some catastrophic historical decisions may have been literally the result of royal exhaustion. Consider Charles VI of France's descent into madness. While he certainly had underlying mental health issues, possibly schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, chronic sleep deprivation would have exacerbated these conditions tremendously. Sleep deprivation can trigger psychotic episodes in vulnerable individuals. It can make delusions seem more real, make paranoia more intense, make mood swings more severe. We know Charles had terrible insomnia, often pacing his chambers at night, unable to rest. His servants reported him having conversations with invisible people in the small hours of the morning. His periods of madness often followed periods of particularly poor sleep. While we can't diagnose historical figures definitively, the correlation between his sleep problems and his mental health problems is striking. Then there's the physical toll. Chronic sleep deprivation suppresses immune function, making people more susceptible to illness. In an era before modern medicine, when a simple infection could kill, this was serious. Kings who couldn't sleep properly were literally making themselves more vulnerable to the diseases that killed so many medieval people. Sleep deprivation also affects emotional regulation. People who don't sleep enough become irritable, prone to anger, less able to control their emotions. Now, give that sleep-deprived person absolute power, and you have a recipe for tyrannical behavior. Some kings' reputation for cruelty and unpredictable rage may have been partly due to the fact that they were exhausted and emotionally dysregulated. Henry VIII is an interesting case study. In his youth, he was known as charming, athletic, relatively even-tempered. In his later years, he became paranoid, cruel, prone to violent mood swings. Yes, he had other health problems, obesity, possibly syphilis, a festering leg wound, but he also had terrible sleep problems documented by his household. His leg pain kept him awake, his anxiety about succession kept him awake, his suspicion of plots kept him awake. The Henry that executed wives and close advisors with minimal provocation was a very different person from the young king, and chronic pain and sleep deprivation were major factors in that transformation. A well-rested, healthy Henry might have been a very different king.
There's also the issue of microsleeps, brief episodes where a sleep-deprived brain essentially shuts down for a few seconds, even while the person appears to be awake. These are dangerous under any circumstances, but imagine experiencing them during crucial negotiations or while reviewing military plans. Decisions made during microsleeps could be disastrous, and the person wouldn't even remember making them. Some historical accounts of kings making bizarre, inexplicable decisions that they later couldn't explain might actually be describing microsleep episodes. The king might have signed a document or given an order while his brain was essentially offline, then woken fully with no memory of having done so. Medieval medical theory didn't understand any of this. They attributed health problems to imbalances in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A king suffering from insomnia might be diagnosed with an excess of choler, yellow bile, making him hot and wakeful, and treated with purges or bloodletting that would only make him weaker and less able to sleep.
Medieval physicians recognized that worry and anxiety prevented sleep, and they had surprisingly sophisticated advice for what they called quieting the mind. They recommended pleasant music, soothing scents, lavender was popular, gentle massage, and avoiding disturbing thoughts before bed. But these sensible recommendations often couldn't overcome the reality of sleeping in a fortified bedroom full of guards and servants, knowing that assassination was a real possibility. Medieval people did use sleep aids, some of which were effective and some of which were dangerous. Poppy preparations, containing opium, were used by those who could afford them. Wine heavily spiced with herbs was common. Valerian root was popular. Some of these substances helped people sleep, but came with their own problems. Opium is addictive, and overdose was a real risk. There are accounts of kings becoming dependent on sleep drafts, needing increasingly large doses to achieve the same effect, suffering withdrawal symptoms if they tried to stop. This would have created another vicious cycle: poor sleep leading to use of sleep aids, leading to dependence, leading to even worse sleep when the aids stopped working effectively. The timing of sleep was also problematic. Medieval sleep patterns were different from modern ones. Before artificial lighting, most people slept in two phases: a first sleep after dark, then a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, then a second sleep before dawn. This was considered normal and natural. But kings' schedules often didn't allow for this natural pattern. They had to attend to business at all hours. Emergencies didn't wait for convenient times. Important visitors arrived at odd hours and had to be received. The natural sleep cycle was constantly disrupted. Moreover, the seasonal variation in daylight hours created challenges. In summer, with long days, bedtime came late. In winter, with long nights, sleeping hours were extended, but often broken by cold, the need to maintain fires, and the general discomfort of medieval winter conditions. Travel was particularly disruptive to sleep. Kings traveled frequently to show themselves to their subjects, to administer distant parts of their realms, to conduct military campaigns. Each new location meant new sleeping arrangements, new security concerns, unfamiliar sounds and smells, different altitudes and climates. The constant travel meant never developing a consistent sleep routine. Military campaigns were the worst. A king leading his army might go days with almost no sleep, sleeping in armor, waking for night watches, staying alert for enemy attacks. The combination of physical exhaustion, mental stress, irregular meals, and almost no sleep could break even strong men. Some military defeats may have been due simply to leaders who were too exhausted to think clearly. There's also the matter of nightmares.
Modern sleep science recognizes that stress and anxiety increase the frequency and intensity of nightmares. Medieval kings living under constant threat would have experienced terrible nightmares. And in an era that believed dreams could be prophetic or demonic in origin, nightmares weren't just unpleasant, they were terrifying, potentially meaningful events that required interpretation and response. Some kings became obsessed with dream interpretation, keeping dream diaries, consulting advisors about their nightmares. This obsession could itself disrupt sleep, as the anxious anticipation of nightmares made restful sleep even harder to achieve. The cumulative effect of all these factors, architectural impediments to sleep, constant security threats, ceremonial disruptions, cognitive and physical effects of sleep deprivation, inadequate medical understanding, and reliance on problematic sleep aids meant that medieval kings lived in a state of perpetual exhaustion. The crown was heavy, not just metaphorically, but in very concrete biological ways. It prevented rest, shortened lives, and impaired the judgment of people whose decisions affected millions.
We've talked about kings struggling to fall asleep, but let's now examine the opposite problem: kings who slept too deeply, who couldn't be woken, or who died in their sleep. These cases were simultaneously tragedies and political crises, because a king who couldn't wake was, in many ways, worse than a dead king. At least, a dead king could be succeeded clearly. The sudden death of kings during sleep was relatively common in the medieval period, and it created immediate crises of succession and legitimacy. Let's explore some cases and what they tell us about the politics of royal sleep. William II of England, known as William Rufus, died suddenly in 1100 during a hunting trip. While not technically in his bed, he died during what was essentially a rest period, and the suspicious circumstances, an arrow to the chest, possibly assassination disguised as a hunting accident, highlighted how vulnerable kings were during any moment of relaxation. More directly relevant is the death of Henry I of England in 1135. Henry reportedly died from food poisoning after eating a surfeit of lampreys, a type of eel-like fish he supposedly loved. But his death came in the night, in his sleep, and by the time servants realized something was wrong in the morning, it was too late. His death triggered the Anarchy, a 19-year civil war over the succession. This illustrates a critical problem. How do you know if a sleeping king is just sleeping or is actually dying? The symptoms of many medieval poisons mimicked sleep. A king could be poisoned, go to bed appearing merely tired, and die in the night while everyone assumed he was resting normally. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, hours had passed. Hours in which evidence could be hidden, accomplices could escape, and political rivals could position themselves for the succession struggle. This led to the practice of regularly checking sleeping kings. Servants would be instructed to verify at intervals that the king was truly sleeping or not unconscious or dead. But how do you check without waking him? And if you do wake him repeatedly, you're preventing the very sleep you're supposedly guarding. The solution was to listen to breathing, to observe the movement of bedcloths, to watch for the subtle signs of life. But this was imperfect. A king in particularly deep sleep might appear dead. More than one servant suffered punishment for raising a false alarm about a king who was merely sleeping soundly. The death of King John of England in 1216 presents another instructive case. John died after a bout of dysentery, but his final days were marked by periods where he would fall into deep, unrousable sleeps. His advisors grew increasingly concerned. Was he dying, or was this some effect of his illness that he'd recover from? How long should they wait before taking action? John's case shows how illness complicated the already complex politics of royal sleep.
A sick king might need extensive rest to recover, but how much rest was therapeutic and how much was a sign of impending death? Physicians had to make judgment calls that were as much political as medical. Declaring the king too ill to rule could trigger succession crises, but failing to recognize dangerous symptoms could result in losing a patient who might have been saved. There's also the phenomenon of stroke, which medieval people didn't understand but frequently witnessed. A king might go to bed apparently healthy and wake up or not wake up, paralyzed, unable to speak, or dead. To witnesses, it seemed like sleep itself had transformed or killed the person, which added to the supernatural fear surrounding sleep. The concept of apoplexy, what we now recognize as stroke, was terrifying precisely because it struck during sleep or rest. A robust king in the evening could be a corpse or a helpless invalid by morning, with no warning, no clear cause. This randomness was disturbing and led to all sorts of preventive measures that were medically useless but psychologically comforting. Special positions for sleeping, dietary restrictions before bed, bloodletting to prevent pressures that might cause apoplexy. Let's consider a particularly dramatic case, the death of Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, in 1503. While not technically a king, popes faced similar security concerns and sleeping arrangements. Alexander died suddenly after a brief illness that came on at night. Rumors immediately spread that he had been poisoned, possibly accidentally drinking wine meant for a cardinal he intended to poison, in one of history's great ironic turnarounds.
Whether the poisoning story is true is debated. But what's significant is how quickly people assumed foul play when a powerful person died in the night. Every nocturnal death was suspect. Every morning discovery of a royal corpse triggered investigations, accusations, and paranoia. There were also cases of kings who fell into comas or coma-like states. Charles VI of France, during his periods of madness, sometimes became completely unresponsive for days. He appeared to sleep but couldn't be woken. This was politically disastrous. France needed a functioning king, but Charles was literally unavailable, locked in something between sleep and consciousness. What do you do with a king who won't wake up? You can't kill him, that's regicide. You can't replace him while he lives, that's usurpation. But you also can't wait indefinitely for him to wake. Regent systems were established, but they were always unstable temporary measures that everyone knew couldn't last indefinitely. The famous case of the princes in the tower, which we touched on earlier, includes this element of permanent sleep. The boys disappeared, and one theory is that they were smothered in their sleep, killed in the most literal sense while sleeping, their deaths made to look peaceful and natural. Whether this actually happened or not, the fact that it was plausible shows how vulnerable sleeping royalty were thought to be. Smothering was an assassination method precisely because it could be made to look like natural death in sleep. A person smothered with a pillow might show no signs of violence. Physicians examining the body might conclude they simply stopped breathing during sleep, which was technically true, just not spontaneous. This method's plausibility made every peaceful death in sleep suspect. There's also the interesting case of narcolepsy, a sleep disorder where people fall asleep suddenly and uncontrollably. We have no confirmed cases of medieval kings with narcolepsy, but if a king had this condition, it would have been politically catastrophic. Imagine a king falling asleep during crucial meetings or worse, during ceremonies or military engagements. Any king showing such symptoms would have been seen as bewitched, cursed, or simply weak and unfit to rule. The inability to control when you slept, normally a sign of deep relaxation and safety, would be interpreted as a dire problem requiring immediate remedy, possibly including replacement.
The Edmund the Confessor death in 1066 happened after days of being in and out of consciousness. He would sleep, wake briefly, speak prophecies or instructions, then fall back into deep sleep. His final days were a kind of slow-motion death, where sleep gradually claimed more and more of him until he didn't wake at all. This gradual process allowed for political maneuvering. Different factions claimed Edward had made deathbed statements supporting their preferred successor. Because he kept falling asleep between pronouncements, it was impossible to get clear, consistent final instructions. His inability to stay awake became a political weapon used by everyone around him. What all these cases illustrate is that the sleep of kings was never just a biological function. It was political, dangerous, and scrutinized. Every morning when a king woke, it was a small political victory. Another night survived, another day to rule. Every night when he failed to wake was a crisis that could reshape kingdoms. The fear of permanent sleep, the sleep of death, haunted medieval royalty. Some kings gave elaborate instructions for how to verify they were truly dead before burial, paranoid about being buried alive. Stories circulated of people who seemed dead but were merely in deep, death-like sleep, who woke in their coffins to horror.
Given all the problems we've discussed, medieval and early modern monarchs weren't passive victims. They tried constantly to improve their sleep, to create conditions that would allow them rest despite the security concerns. Let's explore the sometimes ingenious, sometimes absurd innovations they developed. Let's start with the beds themselves, which evolved significantly over the medieval period. Early medieval royal beds were relatively simple, essentially larger, better-made versions of what wealthy nobles used. But by the later medieval period and into the Renaissance, beds became elaborate engineering projects designed to maximize both security and comfort. The canopy bed reached its peak in this era, and while we think of canopies as decorative, they served real functions. Heavy fabrics could be drawn completely closed, creating a smaller, warmer space within the larger cold chamber. This bed-within-a-room concept allowed better temperature control. Your body heat would warm the enclosed space rather than dissipating into a vast, drafty bedchamber. But canopy beds also created security concerns. An enclosed space could hide assassins. So innovations emerged. Transparent or semi-transparent fabrics for certain panels, allowing guards outside to see in. Fabrics treated with substances that would glow or fluoresce in certain light conditions, making it harder for intruders to hide. Bells or chimes sewn into curtain hems that would ring if disturbed. One particularly paranoid king, records don't specify which, but several sources reference this, had his bed suspended from the ceiling by chains that would creak and swing if anyone climbed onto it from any direction except the guarded approach. This meant that even if an assassin penetrated all other defenses, the bed itself would alert the king to the intrusion. Mattress technology improved significantly. The stacking of multiple mattresses wasn't just for comfort, it elevated the king, making it harder for someone to attack from floor level, and the height created better sight lines to see approaching threats. Some beds were so high that attacking someone lying in them would require the assassin to climb or reach upward, putting them at a disadvantage. Mattresses were also stuffed with materials believed to have protective or healthful properties. Lavender for its calming scent and supposed protective qualities. Rose petals for their association with purity and divine favor. Even exotic materials like silk or rare furs were used not just for luxury, but for their supposed mystical protective properties. The innovation of the testing mattress is particularly interesting. Before the king used a mattress, a servant would sleep on it first, not just to warm it, though that was a benefit, but to ensure it contained no hidden dangers. If the servant survived a night on it without ill effects, it was deemed safe for the king. Let's talk about alarm systems.
Medieval kings couldn't install electronic security, but they developed surprisingly sophisticated mechanical and biological alarms. Dogs were one innovation. Small lapdogs that would bark at unusual sounds or approaching strangers. These dogs would often sleep in the king's chamber or even on the bed itself, serving as living alarms. But dogs had limitations. They could be poisoned, befriended by plotters, or simply fail to bark. So other systems emerged. Geese were sometimes kept in royal chambers or adjacent areas because they're famously alert and noisy. They can't be silenced as easily as dogs and are harder to poison without obvious signs. More mechanical alarms included bells on springs under carpets or rushes, which would ring if stepped on, tripwires attached to chimes, even architectural features designed to amplify sound, vaulted ceilings and strategic placement of reflective surfaces that would carry whispers to the royal bed, allowing the king to overhear conversations near the chamber door. Lighting innovations were crucial. The development of lanterns with reflective backing that could illuminate larger areas with the same amount of candle or oil. Specialized candles made from materials that burn slower and more steadily, providing consistent light through the night. Multiple light sources positioned strategically to eliminate shadows where assassins could hide.
Some kings experimented with mirrors, highly polished metal in the medieval period, actual glass mirrors later, positioned to allow them to see approaches to the bed without having to turn their heads. This was partly for comfort, but also for security. A king could appear to be asleep while actually watching reflected movements in the room. Ventilation presented unique challenges. Fresh air was healthy, but open windows were dangerous. The solution? Elaborate systems of shutters that could be opened from inside the bed curtains using cords and pulleys, allowing the king to control airflow without leaving the protected bed space. Later innovations included screened or barred openings too small for a person, but adequate for air circulation. Some royal bedchambers featured what we might call early air conditioning, systems of channels in walls through which cool air from basement areas could flow, or, in winter, warm air from strategically placed fires. These required careful design to prevent the channels themselves from becoming access routes for assassins. The development of better door locks was crucial. Early medieval doors had simple bars or sliding bolts. By the later medieval period, sophisticated lock mechanisms emerged, some requiring multiple keys, some with combinations, some with false locks that appeared functional but weren't, designed to waste an intruder's time. Some kings had panic rooms, not called that, but functionally similar. A hidden chamber accessible only from the royal bedchamber, stocked with supplies, defensible, where the king could retreat if threatened. The entrance might be hidden behind a tapestry or disguised as ordinary wall paneling. Chemical innovations played a role too. We mentioned poison detection earlier, but there were also attempts at poison prevention. Special coatings for cups and plates that supposedly changed color in the presence of poison. Bezier stones, objects believed to neutralize poison, suspended in wine before drinking. Whether any of these worked is doubtful, but they provided psychological comfort. For helping with sleep itself, various herbal preparations were refined over time. Medieval physicians developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of which plants promoted sleep: valerian, chamomile, hops, passion flower. These were prepared as teas, tinctures, or even sachets to tuck inside pillows. Music as a sleep aid was well understood. Some kings employed musicians to play gentle, soothing music as they fell asleep. Lutes, harps, soft singing. These were thought to calm the mind and ease the transition to sleep. The music had to be gentle enough not to disturb, but interesting enough to occupy worried thoughts. Temperature control improved over time. Better fireplaces with dampers that could be adjusted from across the room. Heated bricks or stones wrapped in cloth and placed in the bed to warm it before the king retired. Later, actual bed warmers, metal pans filled with coals that could be run between the sheets. Bedding materials improved too.
finer linens that were softer against the skin, down from specific birds known for particularly soft feathers, silk coverings that were smooth and cool. These weren't just luxury, they recognized that physical comfort contributed to sleep quality. Some kings experimented with sleep positions, propping themselves up partially rather than lying flat, based on medical theories about humors and digestion. Special wedge-shaped pillows were developed to support these positions. Whether this helped is questionable, but it shows they were thinking about optimizing sleep conditions. The innovation of reading before bed became popular among literate kings. Having documents or devotional texts read aloud in gentle voices could occupy the mind with something other than worries about assassination. This is essentially the ancestor of reading before bed that many people still practice. Scent was taken seriously. Lavender sachets and pillows, herbs strewn among rushes, incense burned before bed, all designed to create a soothing olfactory environment. Some scents were believed to have protective properties against evil spirits, which some believed caused nightmares or threatened sleeping people.
Perhaps the most innovative approach was psychological. The development of meditation and prayer techniques specifically for bedtime. Religious authorities developed specific prayers and mental practices designed to calm the mind and prepare for sleep. Some of these were remarkably sophisticated, essentially early forms of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. The Church developed a whole literature of bedtime prayers and contemplations. These served multiple purposes. They were genuinely calming, they invoked divine protection, and they gave the anxious mind something to focus on other than fears. Some of these prayers were quite beautiful, asking for protection through the night, for peaceful sleep, for good dreams. Not all innovations worked. Some were superstitious nonsense, charms, talismans, magical symbols painted on bed frames. Others were impractical. Some security measures were so elaborate they made sleep even harder. And some solutions created new problems, like sleep medications that left the user groggy and vulnerable the next day. But the fact that these innovations continued, that each generation tried new approaches, shows that sleep was taken seriously as both a need and a challenge. Medieval kings were sleep scientists of a sort, running lifelong experiments on themselves to try to crack the code of how to rest safely when your life depended on staying alert. So far, we've focused largely on kings, but what about queens and the women who shared royal bedchambers? Their experiences of royal sleeplessness were different but equally challenging, complicated by gender expectations, vulnerability, pregnancy, and their own unique security concerns. Queens faced all the same assassination risks as kings, but with additional vulnerabilities. A queen who produced heirs was valuable. One who failed to do so might be seen as expendable or even a barrier to securing the succession. This created unique pressures that affected their sleep. Consider Catherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry VIII. Historical records show she suffered from insomnia, particularly during the years when her failure to produce a male heir became a political crisis. She knew her position was precarious. She knew Henry was seeking ways to end their marriage. She went to bed each night uncertain of her future, and this uncertainty made sleep nearly impossible. Queens in their bedchambers were attended by ladies-in-waiting who served similar functions to the king's grooms of the bedchamber: protection, assistance, and constant surveillance. But these ladies also reported on the queen's activities, conversations, and even her sleeping habits to various interested parties. A queen had even less privacy than a king. The birthing chamber presents a unique case of royal sleeplessness. When a queen went into labor, she was moved to a special chamber that would be her prison for weeks, before, during, and after the birth. These chambers were kept extremely warm, thought necessary for safe childbirth, heavily curtained to exclude all light, and crowded with attendants.
The pregnant queen was expected to rest extensively before labor, but the conditions made this nearly impossible. Hot, airless rooms, constant attendance, anxiety about whether she'd survive the birth, maternal mortality was high, and whether the child would be the desired male heir. Many queens spent the weeks before birth in sleepless anxiety, which certainly didn't help with the ordeal ahead. After birth, new mothers were expected to rest for weeks in these chambers, but actual rest was difficult with a newborn infant, constant medical interventions, often counterproductive, and the parade of important people coming to see the baby and assess the mother's health. Postpartum depression, which certainly existed even if it wasn't recognized medically, would have been exacerbated by sleep deprivation. Queens also faced unique poisoning risks. A pregnant queen could be given substances that would cause miscarriage while appearing to be helpful tonics. A nursing queen could be poisoned through substances that would transfer through breast milk to harm the heir. The paranoia about what she consumed extended beyond her own safety to that of her children. Some queens became as paranoid as their husbands. Catherine of de' Medici of France was notorious for her elaborate security measures. She employed food tasters, trusted no one completely, and maintained a network of spies. She also suffered from terrible insomnia, documented in letters where she complained of sleepless nights spent worrying about her children's political positions. Anne Boleyn, in the months before her execution, was reported to sleep very poorly. Servants noted she would wake frequently, cry out, pray desperately. She knew her position with Henry VIII was deteriorating, and her fear manifested in disrupted sleep. The few months before her arrest were marked by increasing insomnia, which her enemies used as evidence of a guilty conscience.
Queen's consort, wives of reigning kings, had slightly different concerns than queens regnant, ruling queens in their own right. A consort's bedchamber was important primarily for producing heirs. A regnant's bedchamber had all the same security concerns as a king's, plus additional vulnerabilities related to gender. Elizabeth I of England never married, partly because she understood that sharing her bedchamber would mean sharing power. She maintained strict control over who accessed her private apartments. Her ladies-in-waiting were carefully chosen, and she was paranoid about anyone having too much information about her sleeping habits, health, or private life. Elizabeth's bedchamber arrangements were elaborate. Multiple guards, trusted female attendants who slept in her chamber, careful rituals around bedtime. But she also dealt with unique threats. Rumors about secret pregnancies or lovers had to be prevented by ensuring witnesses could testify to her virginity and solitary sleeping arrangements. The difficulty of maintaining this fiction while also being human and needing privacy must have been exhausting. Elizabeth reportedly slept very little, and contemporary accounts describe her as often working late into the night and rising early. Whether this was choice or insomnia driven by the pressures of her position is unclear, but the effect was the same: chronic sleep deprivation. Queens who were regents for young kings faced unique challenges. They held power temporarily, knew it was temporary, and had to defend both their position and their child's rights. This created enormous stress. Some regent queens barely slept, knowing that any sign of weakness would be exploited by noble factions looking to seize control. Blanche of Castile, regent for young Louis IX of France, was documented as barely sleeping during the most contested periods of her regency. She would spend nights strategizing, writing letters, meeting with loyal nobles. Her determination to protect her son's crown required constant vigilance that left little room for rest. There's also the matter of shared royal beds. When a king and queen shared a bed, which was common, the security implications were complex. The queen's vulnerability became the king's vulnerability, and vice versa.
Some royal couples slept in separate chambers for this reason. If one was attacked, the other might escape and rally forces. But separate sleeping arrangements created their own issues, particularly around producing heirs. The timing of when the royal couple slept together was noted, recorded, and would become important evidence if questions of paternity arose. This meant that even the intimate act of sleeping together was public knowledge, documented by servants and courtiers. Some queens dealt with the sleeplessness by developing their own remedies. Isabella of Castile was known to use herbal preparations and was quite knowledgeable about medicinal plants. She essentially self-medicated for insomnia with various tinctures, some of which probably helped and some of which were useless or harmful. Female servants who attended queens had their own sleep challenges. Ladies-in-waiting were often required to sleep in the queen's chamber, ready to attend to any need. But they were also expected to be well-rested, pleasant, and effective during the day. The strain of this schedule drove many to exhaustion. Wet nurses present another interesting case. When royal babies were nursed by women other than their mothers, common practice, these wet nurses had to be available at all hours. They essentially lived in the royal nursery, their sleep patterns dictated by the infant's feeding schedule. Their health and rest were monitored because they directly affected the heir's well-being. The vulnerability of royal women during sleep was sometimes exploited politically. Rumor campaigns suggested that queens had lovers who visited at night, even when this was physically impossible given the crowded bedchamber conditions. These rumors didn't need to be believable, they just needed to exist, to taint the queen's reputation and put pressure on her. Queens who survived their husbands faced new sleep challenges. As queen dowagers, they lost some security protections. They might be moved to less secure residences. Their political value diminished, which meant fewer resources devoted to their safety. Some dowager queens lived in fear, knowing that they were vulnerable and that their deaths might benefit various political factions. Catherine of Valois, Queen Dowager after Henry V's death, lived for years in reduced circumstances, her remarriage restricted, her access to her royal children limited. Contemporary accounts suggest she suffered from poor health and sleep problems, exacerbated by her political powerlessness and fear for her children's futures. The experience of royal women's sleep, or lack thereof, reminds us that the crown's weight was felt by more than just those who wore it. Queens, consorts, regents, princesses, and the women who served them all participated in the exhausting vigilance that royal life required. Their sleeplessness was part of the price of power, even when they held that power only second-hand through their relationships to men. And unlike kings, whose sleeplessness might be seen as devoted vigilance or strength, women's sleeplessness was often interpreted as weakness, hysteria, or guilty conscience. The same inability to sleep that made a king seem dedicated made a queen seem unstable. The gendered interpretation of sleeplessness added another layer of difficulty to an already impossible situation.
We've explored how medieval kings slept, or more accurately, how they didn't sleep. Now let's examine the consequences, how chronic royal sleep deprivation actually shaped historical events, changed the course of wars, and altered the fate of nations. Let's start with a specific, dramatic example, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. Young King Richard II, only 14 years old, faced a massive uprising. After days of crisis, negotiation, and violence, Richard met the rebel leader Wat Tyler at Smithfield. During this confrontation, Tyler was killed by one of Richard's men, and the situation could have exploded into a massacre. Richard, showing remarkable courage for a teenager, rode directly into the crowd of rebels and convinced them to disperse peacefully. But here's what's less known. Richard had barely slept in days due to the crisis.
Contemporary accounts mention him appearing exhausted, almost dazed. Some historians suggest his famous boldness in riding into the rebel crowd might have been partially due to impaired judgment from sleep deprivation. A well-rested king might have made a more cautious choice. It worked out, but it easily could have gone differently. One of history's turning points may have been shaped by a sleep-deprived teenager making a risky decision he might not have made if properly rested. The 100 Years' War offers multiple examples of battles influenced by commanders' sleep deprivation. Kings and princes leading armies often went days with minimal sleep during campaigns. The disastrous French defeat at Agincourt in 1415 has many tactical explanations, but French commanders had been up most of the previous night in their heavily armored positions, while the English, despite being exhausted from their long march, had at least rested briefly before the battle. Could better rested French commanders have made different tactical choices? We can't know for certain, but sleep science tells us that exhausted leaders make poorer decisions, respond more slowly to changing circumstances, and assess risk less accurately. Some medieval battles might have had different outcomes if the commanders had slept better the night before. Consider the decision-making of sleep-deprived monarchs regarding succession and marriage, decisions that shaped dynasties. Henry VIII's increasing paranoia and impulsivity in his later years, when he was barely sleeping due to pain and anxiety, led to decisions that traumatized his children and destabilized the English succession for decades. His execution of Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, came during a period when he was documented as sleeping very poorly. His mood swings and paranoid suspicions, likely exacerbated by sleep deprivation, led him to see plots everywhere. A better rested Henry might have investigated more carefully, might have shown more mercy, might have prevented some of the trauma that shaped the future Elizabeth I. The Wars of the Roses, that decades-long series of civil conflicts in England, can be partially understood through the lens of exhausted decision-making. Kings and lords making alliance decisions, choosing whether to fight or negotiate, deciding whom to trust, all while operating on minimal sleep during constant crisis. The infamous order by Richard III, allegedly, to murder the princes in the Tower, if it happened, might have been a decision made by an exhausted, paranoid king who couldn't sleep for fear of the challenge these boys represented to his crown. A well-rested leader might have found another solution. Sleep deprivation doesn't excuse such decisions, but it helps explain how people convince themselves that terrible actions are necessary. Treaties and diplomatic agreements were often negotiated in grueling sessions that lasted days, with minimal sleep for the participants. The Treaty of Troyes, 2020, which temporarily gave the French crown to English kings, was negotiated partly by exhausted diplomats who'd been in talks for weeks. Some scholars suggest some provisions that later proved problematic might not have been included if the negotiators had been thinking more clearly. Religious decisions by kings were also affected. The conversion of various European monarchs to Christianity or between Christian denominations happened during periods of personal crisis when sleep was difficult. Constantine's conversion before the Battle of Milvian Bridge supposedly followed a vision, but was it a genuine religious experience or a dream or hallucination brought on by pre-battle stress and insomnia? We can't know, but we do know that sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, and that people under extreme stress often interpret these experiences religiously. The conversion of kings shaped the religious identity of entire nations, and some of these conversions might have been influenced by the altered mental states produced by sleeplessness. The Crusades offer another angle. Kings who took the cross and committed to crusading made these decisions in various states of exhaustion. The enthusiasm for crusading that swept through European courts came in waves, often following periods of particular stress and sleeplessness for key monarchs. The decision to commit thousands of men and enormous resources to distant wars was made by people whose judgment may have been impaired by chronic sleep deprivation. Medieval justice was directly affected by royal sleeplessness. Kings served as supreme judges, hearing cases and making legal decisions. A tired, irritable king might make harsher judgments that arrested one. Some executions, exiles, and confiscations that shaped noble families' fates for generations might have been ordered by kings who were quite literally not thinking straight due to lack of sleep. The economic decisions of monarchs, taxation levels, trade agreements, currency manipulation, all required complex judgment. Sleep-deprived decision-making could lead to poor economic choices that would affect millions of subjects. Some financial crises in medieval kingdoms might trace back to decisions made by exhausted monarchs who didn't fully appreciate the consequences of their choices. There's also the matter of paranoid decisions made during periods of particularly bad insomnia. Some purges of courtiers, some executions of supposed traitors, some preemptive strikes against perceived threats might have been the products of sleep-deprived paranoia rather than genuine danger. These actions, once taken, couldn't be undone, and often created the very instability and opposition they meant to prevent.
The health of kings affected by poor sleep had succession implications. Kings who died young due to stress-related illnesses exacerbated by sleep deprivation left young heirs who required regencies, which often led to political instability. Some civil wars and succession crises might have been prevented if kings had lived longer, healthier lives, which might have happened if they'd slept better. Consider also the cultural impact. The medieval obsession with security, fortification, and defensive architecture was partly driven by royal paranoia about nighttime attacks. Castles designed to be defensible at night, with sleeping quarters in the most protected areas, shaped medieval military architecture. This influenced not just royal residences, but also how nobles and wealthy people built their homes. The development of police forces and night watches in medieval cities can be traced partly to royal concern about nocturnal threats. Kings wanted their capitals to be safe at night, partly for their own security and partly to set an example. These early law enforcement systems, developed to protect sleeping royalty and their subjects, were precursors to modern police forces. Legal concepts around nighttime crimes also developed. Crimes committed at night were often punished more severely because they were seen as more cowardly and dangerous, taking advantage of victims' sleep. This distinction, which originated partly in royal concerns about nighttime vulnerability, persisted into modern legal codes. The medical understanding of sleep developed partly through royal patronage. Kings who suffered from insomnia funded physicians to study sleep, leading to gradual improvement in understanding, even if much of it was still wrong by modern standards. Royal interest in sleep remedies drove some medical research and development of treatments. Cultural attitudes towards sleep itself were shaped by royal example. The idea that important people sleep less than common folk, that sleep is for the weak, that burning the candle at both ends is a mark of dedication, these ideas were reinforced by the example of kings who slept very little, whether by choice or necessity. This cultural legacy persists today. The valorization of overwork and sleep deprivation, the idea that successful people sleep less, the hustle culture that sees sleep as wasted time, all of this has roots partly in the example of medieval monarchs who ruled without resting. We inherited their insomnia as a cultural value, even though modern sleep science shows it's harmful. The irony is profound. Medieval kings couldn't sleep because their lives depended on constant vigilance. Modern people often don't sleep because they've internalized the idea that sleep is less important than achievement, an idea that would have baffled the peasants and workers of medieval times who understood that rest was essential to life. The crown that never rested left us a legacy of sleeplessness, a cultural inheritance that still affects how we think about rest, work, and success.
Understanding this history might help us recognize that our modern sleep problems aren't just individual issues, but are connected to deeper cultural patterns that trace back to medieval monarchs who couldn't rest because their lives literally depended on staying awake. We've journeyed together through the restless nights of medieval monarchy, from the architectural fortress of the royal bedchamber to the biological effects of chronic sleep deprivation. From the servants who guarded sleeping kings to the assassins who tried to kill them. From the queens who shared this sleeplessness to the historical consequences that rippled out from exhausted royal decision-making. What have we learned about the crown that never rested? First, we've learned that power and vulnerability are inseparable. The same crown that gave medieval kings absolute authority also made them targets. The throne elevated them, but it also exposed them. Sleep, which should have been a refuge, became their most dangerous time. They couldn't rest because rest required trust, and trust was a luxury kings couldn't afford. This teaches us something profound about the nature of power itself. We often think of power as providing security, but absolute power paradoxically creates absolute vulnerability. The medieval king had more to lose than anyone in his kingdom, which meant he had more to fear. His subjects could sleep peacefully in their humble homes, unworried about assassination plots. The king, in his magnificent palace surrounded by guards, could not. There's a lesson here about the true cost of ambition and achievement. Yes, medieval kings had wealth, status, and power, but they paid for it with their sleep, their peace of mind, their ability to ever fully relax. Was it worth it? Many of them, in private moments recorded by chroniclers, expressed doubt. The crown was heavy, and its weight was felt most acutely at night, when it prevented them from experiencing the rest that even the lowest peasant enjoyed. Second, we've learned about the inadequacy of external solutions to internal problems. Medieval kings built elaborate security systems, developed complex rituals, employed armies of servants, all in an attempt to create the conditions for safe sleep. And all of it failed to solve the fundamental problem. You can't rest when you're afraid, and fear is internal, not external. No amount of guards, locked doors, or food tasters could eliminate the basic fact that someone determined enough could probably kill you. The security theater helped psychologically, but it couldn't provide genuine security. And meanwhile, all the precautions themselves made sleep harder by creating noise, disruption, and constant awareness that you were in danger. This speaks to modern life, too. We pursue external markers of success and security, wealth, status, achievements, thinking they'll provide peace of mind. But if we haven't addressed the internal anxieties, the external success just creates more to worry about, more to lose, more to protect. The medieval kings teach us that you can't buy peace of mind, and you can't build walls high enough to keep out fear. Third, we've seen how individual suffering scales to affect entire societies. When kings couldn't sleep, their judgment was impaired, and their decisions affected millions. Wars were declared, alliances made, justice dispensed, economies managed, all by people who weren't thinking clearly because they were exhausted. This is equally true today. Leaders making crucial decisions while sleep-deprived is still a problem. Military commanders, politicians, business executives, many operate on insufficient sleep, and their impaired judgment affects us all. The medieval period shows us this isn't a new problem, and it won't solve itself. We need to recognize that well-rested leaders make better decisions, and societies should value leaders who prioritize their rest. Fourth, we've discovered that the gender dimension of power affects even something as biological as sleep. Queens and royal women faced all the same security threats as kings, plus additional vulnerabilities related to pregnancy, childbearing, and their dependent status. Their sleeplessness was often interpreted differently than men's, as weakness rather than vigilance, as hysteria rather than dedication. This reminds us that power dynamics affect even our most intimate biological experiences. Sleep isn't just a personal matter. It's shaped by social position, gender expectations, political circumstances. Understanding this helps us see how deeply social inequality penetrates into individual lives. Fifth, we've learned about the power of ritual and routine in managing anxiety. The elaborate bedtime ceremonies of medieval courts weren't just about security. They were psychological tools for managing fear. By turning the dangerous transition to sleep into a controlled, predictable ceremony, kings could feel like they were doing something to protect themselves. The rituals didn't actually make them much safer, but they made them feel safer, which allowed some possibility of sleep. There's wisdom here about the human need for ritual, for predictability, for feeling like we have some control even when we fundamentally don't. Modern people who develop bedtime routines are following an instinct that medieval kings understood well. Sixth, we've seen how physical environment shapes psychological experience. The architecture of royal bedchambers, crowded, public, fortified, made sleep nearly impossible. This teaches us that we can't separate our inner experience from our outer circumstances. You can't think yourself into sleeping well in a terrible environment. Physical conditions matter. For modern people, this means taking seriously the importance of sleep environment: darkness, quiet, comfort, temperature, safety. These aren't luxuries, but necessities for the biological function of sleep. Medieval kings understood this and tried to optimize their sleep environments, even if their security needs often contradicted their comfort needs. Seventh, we've discovered that some problems don't have good solutions. Medieval kings needed to sleep for their health and judgment. They also needed to stay vigilant for their survival. These needs were in fundamental conflict, and there was no way to fully satisfy both. Sometimes life presents us with contradictory requirements, and we do the best we can while acknowledging the inherent impossibility of the situation. Medieval kings modeled this. They didn't solve the problem of how to sleep safely, but they managed it as best they could, season after season, year after year, for their entire reigns. Finally, we've learned about the profound human capacity for endurance. These kings and queens lived for years, sometimes decades, in a state of chronic sleep deprivation that would break most people. They continued to rule, to make decisions, to maintain their dignity and authority even while exhausted and frightened. There's something admirable about this persistence, even as we recognize the tragedy of lives lived without rest. They showed that humans can endure far more than we think, can continue functioning under conditions that seem impossible. This isn't necessarily a good thing. Sometimes we should acknowledge that situations are unsustainable rather than just enduring, but it reveals something about human resilience. So what does all this mean for us? Comfortable in our modern beds, unlikely to face assassination attempts in the night. It means we should appreciate the gift of safe, peaceful sleep. We take for granted that we can lock a door and sleep reasonably securely, that we don't need armed guards watching us rest, that we can trust the people around us enough to fully lose consciousness near them. Medieval kings would have envied us this simple peace. It means we should recognize that power and ambition have real costs. The hustle culture that encourages constant work and minimal sleep is selling us a version of the medieval king's dilemma: sacrifice rest for achievement. But we've seen where that leads: impaired health, poor decisions, lives lived in exhaustion. Maybe the peasant who slept soundly had something the king never possessed. It means we should think carefully about the environments we create for sleep, both for ourselves and for others. Just as medieval bedchambers could enable or prevent rest, our modern bedrooms, schedules, and technologies either support sleep or undermine it. We have more control over this than medieval kings did. We should use it wisely. It means we should extend compassion to leaders who make mistakes under pressure. Yes, they should be held accountable, but we should also recognize that exhausted people can't think clearly, and we've structured many leadership roles to guarantee exhaustion. If we want better leadership, we might need to allow leaders to rest. And perhaps most importantly, it means recognizing that rest is not weakness, but necessity. The medieval valorization of sleeplessness as dedication and strength was born of genuine necessity. Kings who slept soundly might not wake up. We don't face that necessity, yet we've inherited the cultural value that sleep is for the weak, that successful people sleep less. The medieval kings would have laughed bitterly at this. They slept poorly because they had to, not because they wanted to. They would have treasured the ability to sleep safely and well. We have that ability. We should use it. The crown that never rested teaches us, finally, about what truly matters. All the power, wealth, and glory of medieval monarchy couldn't buy these kings what their poorest subjects had: peaceful sleep. In the end, what good is ruling a kingdom if you can't rest? What value has achievement if it costs you your peace? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're worth asking, and they're worth remembering the next time you lie down to sleep in safety and comfort. Gifts that medieval kings, for all their power, could never fully possess. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of history's most exclusive insomnia club. If this journey has given you new appreciation for your own ability to rest, or new understanding of the human cost of power, then my work is done. Please subscribe to continue these explorations of history's hidden stories, and share in the comments what aspect of medieval life you'd like us to investigate next. Sleep well, dear travelers, and as you drift off tonight, remember the kings who couldn't. May we all find the rest they were denied, and may we never take for granted the simple, profound gift of peaceful sleep. Good night.